If fossils are to show evolution, then we have to be able to see a change from one type to another type. And as we looked at the fossil record in general, we saw that was not the case according to the evolutionists themselves. There are distinct and separate types. There are gaps, discontinuities between all of the major kinds. And we see that's very definitely the truth as well when we get to the gap between apes and men, though certainly there has been a great deal of effort put to try to show a progression from one to the other here, and that's what would have to be done. And we're often referred to the little gradual progressions of the little man up to the big man in the charts in the textbooks. We want to look at that evidence and see if there is such a progression, but before we do, let's look at what I'll refer to as the gap before the main gap, and that's the one leading up to the apes. Notice the statement by Donald Johanson, the discoverer of Lucy, one of the more famous ape men, so-called. He says, at any rate, modern gorillas and orangs and chimpanzees spring out of nowhere, as it were. They're here today, they have no yesterday. He says, this is not a situation where you show something leading up to the apes, but instead you see the gap before you get to it, and that's typical. Often we're told that when we talk about this that we misrepresent when we say that evolutionists believe that we came from the apes, because evolutionists don't believe that they believe they came from a common ancestor, not an ape. And here we see an example of that kind of statement made by Bill Allen. He was editor of National Geographic just in 2004, when he says humans are not descended from apes, but then Charles Darwin never claimed that we are. Now this is absolutely amazing to me, that somebody like Bill Allen would say Darwin never claimed that we came from apes. It's just simply not so, and it is a quibble that distorts the position. As Darwin says, a naturalist would undoubtedly have ranked as an ape or a monkey. However much the conclusion may revolt our pride, our early progenitors would have been properly designated. So we came from apes, according to Charles Darwin. It's a quibble to say that we don't. Now, of course, it wasn't a modern ape, but he was definitely an ape, according to the evolutionist. Ernst Houghton of Harvard wrote the book Up from the Ape. He was head of the anthropology department at Harvard, and from that title, you get a pretty good idea of what he thought on the subject, but notice his comments. If we are descended from apes, our remote ancestors ought to look their part. You may not be willing to admit that you resemble an ape, but as you trace back the genealogical lines, you will have to admit that somewhere in your family tree there squats an ape. Here's head of the anthropology department at Harvard. I think he believes we came from apes, and he's not unique. And editor of National Geographic notwithstanding, this is certainly what is taught. But this individual who believes that an ape squats in your family tree goes on to make a very interesting statement. He says, to attempt to restore the soft parts, as in contrast to the hard parts, which he's been talking about, difficult enough. To attempt to restore the soft parts is even more hazardous undertaking. The lips, the eyes, the nasal tip leave no clues on the underlying bony parts. Now, if you watch some of the TV programs, they can just take a glance at the bones and they know exactly what the person looked like. Well, you can learn a lot from the bones, but you can't learn what the lips and the eyes and the ears and the nasal tip look like from the bones, and that is what leaves the major impression. And certainly when you are restoring these so-called ape men, you can make them look very apish if you change the lips, the eyes, the ears, the nasal tip, and so forth, which is certainly what is done, and we'll document that. He says you can, with equal facility, model on a Neanderthal skull the features of a chimpanzee or the lineaments of a philosopher. Now, most philosophers that I know, some of them look a little strange, but I think you can tell the difference between them and a chimpanzee. But you can model the same thing, either of the two, from the same skull. A very important point is made by Roger Lehmann, who's editor of Research News Science magazine, certainly a devout evolutionist and a close friend and co-author with Richard Leakey. He says, and this is maybe the most critical point that we'll make regarding fossil men, and he makes it for me. The key issue is the ability to correctly infer a genetic relationship between two species on the basis of a similarity in appearance. Now, we talked about similarities when we talked about the fossil record. And the only way you can tell that the fossil means anything is it's similar to this one, and you interpret that. But that is obviously misleading. He goes on to say it's deceptive and gives a specific example, because similarity in structure, he says, does not imply an identical genetic heritage. A shark, which is a fish, a porpoise, which is a mammal, looks similar. But this is the ball game when it comes to paleoanthropology. You look at this bone and you look at that bone and you say, well, it looks similar or it doesn't look similar, and that's the way you tell ancestors. But it's a deceptive basis, and even the evolutionists acknowledge this. Roger Lewontin, is actually bending over backwards, to be fair here. He'd been caught in a rather intemperate statements, being interviewed by Harper's, and he's backtracking a little, and I want to be fair to him. But he acknowledges we don't know anything about the ancestors of the human species. Now, to be fair, we emphasize the word no. Now, he believes devoutly that we came from the apes, and he thinks he knows how it, but in terms of knowing, absolute knowing, we don't. All the fossils which have been dug up and are claimed to be ancestors, we haven't the faintest idea whether they're ancestors. Now, I'm embarrassed to use that statement because I know he wouldn't make that under normal circumstances, because he certainly has a faint idea. He has more than that. He has a deep conviction, and I don't want to misrepresent that. But in terms of knowledge, in terms of absolutely knowing, no, you can't know that this bone is kin to that bone. You dig up the bones, he says, it's up to you to draw the lines. And he says there are no lines when you dig the bones up. You draw them, and of course that's based on similarity, which is deceptive. But if you understand that he's talking about absolute knowledge, he's saying, no, we don't know. But we see lineups like this in the textbooks, and that in the minds of a lot of people is proof. See, there's scientific evidence. It's been demonstrated. Here's the Homo erectus that leads to the Neanderthal and to modern men. Well, this is the typical lineup as it's represented in most textbooks. It's not really typical as you study paleoanthropology, but we'll summarize it and use it as an outline for our session in this brief consideration of paleoanthropology. It actually looks about like this when you see it in the textbooks. The star of the show, and where we'll spend most of our time in this first session, is with Australopithecus, South African ape man. That led to Homo erectus, that led to Neanderthal, and finally up to moderns. Australopithecus is featured as the major proof in the minds of a lot of people. And when I talk to people about why they believe in evolution, many times they'll refer to the ape men, and here are the pictures that they see in the books, and here's the work that the Leakeys did over in South Africa, and this provides proof. Well, let's see what the evidence is. This is a representation by Time Life of this ape man, Australopithecus, and actually was made famous by Louis Leakey a number of years ago with his movie Dr. Leakey and the Dawn of Man, and this was shown in thousands of classrooms across the country, and he's shown going step by step down the Avois Gorge over in Africa, where he found this South African ape man. I think was an ape, but actually his wife was the one who found it, and I've wondered why some of the women's lib movements haven't really capitalized on this. She's the one that made the discovery. He got the credit for it. But Notice the statement by Roger Lehmann, again, editor of Research News. He knows these people well. They're good friends. They've written books together, and he can represent them accurately. He says Richard and his parents, Louis and Mary, have held to a view of human origins for nearly half a century now, that the line of true man has a separate ancestry that goes back millions and millions of years. He doesn't believe one led from the other. They are separate as far back as he's been able to see, and he sees no connection as far back as he's been able to look. He says Australopithecus, the ape man Australopithecus, has nothing to do with human ancestry. And of course, you've seen this in National Geographic or in your earth science textbook. Don't hold your breath. But here is one who knows these people well, and he says they didn't believe that Australopithecus led to man. They were separate as far back as they see them in the fossil record, and they had nothing to do with the human ancestry. Richard, or Louis Leakey, for example, is touted as the hero of the evolutionist in the movie Gorillas of the Mist, and he is one who's the leader, the icon of evolution. They'll not tell you that he actually gave up on Darwinism, and is quoted in this manner in the Chicago American, actually months before he passed away. Dr. Leakey, and this was after he had lectured there the night before, Dr. Leakey bases his repudiation of Darwin on the results of his long search in East Africa for the remains of the original man. Now, he's often touted as proof of evolution, but never is it acknowledged in any of the textbooks that he actually reached a different conclusion based on the evidence and decided Darwinism was not a good explanation for what he saw. When we look at Australopithecus, we can see why. Charles Oxnard is one of the leading authorities in the world. He is dean, or was at the time this was written, of the graduate school and professor of biology and anatomy at the University of Southern California. Writing an American biology teacher as an acknowledged leader in the field, one of the leading experts, he says, referring to Australopithecus, it's reminiscent of the orangutan and not that much like humans. Now, I'll assure you, you'll never find a statement like that in your textbooks. It looks like an orangutan. It doesn't look that much like a human. May well have been bipeds, that is, walked on two legs, but if so, was not in the human manner. He didn't walk on two legs as we did. They may have been quite capable climbers, as much at home in the trees as on the ground. And so this was an ape, much more like an ape than like a human. Maybe two legs, but a knuckle walker, at home in the trees. Again, not the picture that you see represented in the textbooks. Lord Sully Zuckerman is perhaps the leading expert in England, and certainly has been for a number of years. He's quoted by Lehmann in his book Bones of Contention, referring to Zuckerman, dismissal of the Australopithecines as having anything at all to do with human evolution. They're just bloody apes he's reputed to have observed examining Australopithecine remains in South Africa. They are just apes. He dismissed them as having anything to do, and is perhaps the leading authority in Europe in paleoanthropology. He says in his book, Beyond the Ivory Tower, Australopithecine skull is in fact so overwhelmingly simian as opposed to human. And then he refers to figure 5, which we'll look at in a moment. Overwhelmingly ape-like, simian, as opposed to human, that the contrary proposition could be equated to an assertion that black is white. You seldom get scientists who make that flat-footed a statement, but it's very obvious he is persuaded that these are apes. They are not humans, and it's just like calling white black, black white to say the opposite. And then he shows why in figure 5. He's looking here at illustrations of the chimpanzee skull on the left and the Australopithecine skull on the right. And as you look at these pictures, you see, wow, they sure do look like each other, don't they? the top view, yeah, that looks pretty close, much closer to each other than to humans. And then you look at the bottom and you say, well, yeah, that's closer to each other, the chimpanzee to the Australopithecine, than they are to humans. Now, we're told, well, yes, that's true, except you do see a difference. And in the bottom picture, you can see that the teeth are different. You see the large canine tooth with the chimpanzee, the diastema, the gap that it fits into, which is not the case with the Australopithecine. It's more like the human U-shaped dental arcade. And so that makes the man, the fact that his teeth are different. What they do leave out is that the Galata baboon, which is 100% ape, has teeth just like this. And so it's not unique to humans. Some apes have teeth like this. Australopithecus did, so did the Galata baboon. Perhaps the most famous example of the Australopithecine type, the Afar afarensis, was found by Donald Johansen, called Lucy. And a lot of notoriety and always in the textbooks. In fact, big news recently in Houston where it's going to be on display for a while. And I've had people say, well, look at Lucy. This is proof of evolution. This is really frustrating because the information has been distorted. And the most obvious interpretation is this was an ape. I'd like to introduce and show a brief clip of Dr. David Minton. He's a professor of anatomy. He's taught in St. Louis at the American University there for 20 years, and he's commenting on it. Now, all of the people that I quote, unless we tell you otherwise, are devout evolutionists. Dr. Minton is a creationist, but a highly qualified creationist. And he's describing what actually happened, and actually he'll introduce Dr. Lovejoy, who acknowledges what has happened.
So you get the picture? The creatures like Lucy have the ape orientation of the iliac blades. Now, what are the evolutionists going to do about that? You're not going to believe this. Nova, have you heard Nova? There was a PBS Nova series in which Dr. Owen Lovejoy, a very distinguished, famous paleoanthropologist, was involved. And he's looking at Lucy's skeleton here, and he's lamenting the fact that the hips are all wrong. They're supposed to be human-like hips, so you can walk the way the Latoli footprints showed she walked, but they don't look like human hips, they look like ape hips. What to do about this? Watch it. You'll get a big kick out of this.
The ape that stood up. It was a revolutionary idea. We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossils.
So you see they were broken and they don't fit together properly. They did speculate in the program as to exactly who was responsible for breaking the hip, and current scientific evidence suggests perhaps a deer stepped on it. Here you can see a deer foot stepping on the bone. Isn't that a bummer? Let's see where it goes from here.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost.
This is a power saw, friends. You may want to put your goggles on.
Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster.
Notice he's removing whole parts, not just cutting.
He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
Look how perfect. You can read a newspaper through the hole.
As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Yeah, now, this is what we call science. You can teach this in the public schools, but you can't criticize it, because if you do, that would be religious.
Unfortunately for the evolutionist, dozens of other examples of the afarensis form have been found. Lucy's not the only example, and they wouldn't try to change all of the hips. Arlene Ziltman of the University of California is commenting on, more recently, on what we have learned about the whole picture. She says they're like, and this is quoted in Science News, Ziltman compares the pygmy chimpanzee to Lucy, one of the oldest known hominid fossils, and finds the similarities striking. She says they're almost identical in body size, in stature, in brain size. Ziltman argues they indicate that the chimps use their limbs in much the same way Lucy did. And when, in other words, she was a knuckle walker like the other apes, and they're just virtually identical. She was an ape, she was a chimp, and this is what the leading authorities have acknowledged in spite of Lovejoy and Johansson's shenanigans. The main effort has been to cause them to be human because they stand upright. Here's the argument. If they stand upright, then obviously they're human. Well, I know lizards that walk upright. What does this prove? The fact that an ape decides to walk upright? Well, actually, we have an example of that happening that's referred to here from CBC Health and Science News. Just a few years ago, there were some apes, macaw monkeys, that got sick and almost died, and one of them, after it almost died, recovered and walked just, they called it ramrod straight from that point forward. The zoo workers say she's started, when she got sick, walking upright exclusively. A zoo veterinarian says he's not sure why she's altered her behavior, but here's a change from walking like an ape to walking upright. Why did she do that? Well, the zoo worker went on to speculate that the illness could have caused brain damage, and so maybe that's why we walk upright. This is maybe why the ape did. It's strictly an interpretation, again, based on similarities, many similarities imagined. Notice the distorted kind of interpretation to which we're subjected that was in National Geographic, the latter part of 2006. The human ancestor, here is the front page, and of course this is an orangutan, blurred the lines between ape and human for example. Here's a new find, and here is the real solution to all of the problems. For example, her femur from knee to hip is close to that of a modern human, implying she walked efficiently on two legs. I'm sorry, that's just not true, but that's what's touted in National Geographic. We go to a much more respected scientific journal, Nature, to get the actual evidence. In fact, numbers of science journals have reported and bewailed what had been presented there by National Geographic. Here's the description in Nature by the authors who found it and who described it. Incisors are larger. Their overall morphology is similar to that of juvenile apes. The gorilla-like scapula and long curved manual phalanges, that's the fingers, the scapula is the collarbone, raise new questions. And the collarbone is especially significant because it bears the weight for knuckle walkers. The shape of the scapula resembles the scapula of juvenile and adult gorillas. Now that the scapula of the species can be examined in full for the first time, it's unexpected to find the strongest similarities with the gorilla. The similarities are not with humans, they're with the gorillas, especially the areas that are diagnostic of the way they walked. weight-bearing and terrestrial knuckle walking is what's implied by the similarities that are found. And then it goes on to make an amazing statement. These Australopith specimens can be accommodated within the range of intraspecific variation of African apes. Yes, the apes vary. You see different types. But what we see here is within the range of the variation of apes. Now, that's not the way it was presented in National Geographic. You need to be aware that evidence is often severely manipulated. There are similarities, but the representation of the similarity is often just distorted. We are told that a good example of these Australopithecine footprints were found by Mary Leakey in Africa. They were from the same, quote, time period as they assessed the time. And they were beautiful footprints, but they were human footprints. They were very human. The ape, of course, has a hand for a foot, and here are human footprints. Now, if Lucy made these, this is pretty good evidence that she walked upright in spite of the anatomy that we've now found. Notice the description of Mary Leakey herself, who found them. They belong to the genus Homo, or true man, rather than to man-apes like Australopithecus, who was once thought to be a forerunner of man. Now, this is Mary Leakey's statement. They once thought that, but she doesn't. Refers to the dates. I disagree, but let's play the game their way and see how it comes out. We'll talk about dates in another session. Here is a time period right in the middle of the Australopithecines. In fact, this is ancient. This is at the beginning of the Australopithecine time period. But they would be, in Mary Leakey's words, people not unlike ourselves. And I believe they were made by people. There's no evidence that were made by anything else. But what's really ripped it for the idea that Lucy made them is that, unlike with the early specimens, which had no feet, now we found a number of specimens that had good feet, and they were ape feet. Referring to Australopithecine afarensis, that's Lucy's type. The recent descriptions of 4 articulating foot bones from the 3 to 3.5 million-year-old deposits in South African cave site Sturfontein support this. The divergent big toe, and that's what distinguishes the ape foot from our foot, indicates some degree of prehensile grasping. They wrap around a limb, as in apes. And we see here the human foot form and the ape foot form, and Lucy had a foot clearly indicated from the portion that was found in the more recent skeletons like an ape. Lucy didn't make these footprints. Humans made these footprints at the same time, we're told, that Australopithecus was around. And so, like the Leakey say, you've got evidence of man and apes, Australopithecines, as far back as you go, together, not one leading to the other. William Howells, who at the time this statement was made was head of the Department of Anthropology at Harvard University, and he refers to the work of Russell Tuttle, who he says is the leading expert in the world on gaits and limbs and fossil footprints. He finds that all aspects of the footprints, especially are remarkably like modern feet, modern human feet, and that the afar prints, that's Lucy's feet, are significantly different than humans. And so you do have human footprints back there. That's not helping the evolutionist. These critters are supposed to have led to man, but you've got human footprints back there with them, and then their feet were significantly different. Howells goes on to say the pelvis was by no means modern, in spite of Lovejoy's jerry-rigging with the power saw, nor were the feet. He says the toes were more curved than ours. They're for wrapping around limbs. The heel bones lack our stabilizing tubercles. A couple of small ligaments that in us tighten the arch from underneath were apparently not present. In other words, if you're going to walk like we do, you need an arch that can contract. And the finger bones were curved, again, just like you see in the apes, as they are in tree-climbing apes. Now, what is he describing here? You don't have to be an expert to understand that he's talking about apes, but the experts do acknowledge this, and we're looking here at the three probably most authoritative experts in the field. David Pilbeam of Yale, Glenn Isaac of Harvard, Matt Cartmill of Duke, and we'll say more about their credentials in a moment. But they say the status of Lucy has significantly shriveled. The Australopithecines, and this was not recent, this was 86. This ought to be in the textbooks, but it isn't. Australopithecines are rapidly shrinking back to the status of peculiarly specialized apes. Why would they say that? Well, because that's what you see when you look at the bones. They look like ape bones. And more recently, if you want a recent quote here from 2007, April 10, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, edited by David Pilbeam, morphology on a recently discovered specimen of Australopithecus afarensis, that's Lucy's category, closely matches that of gorillas and casts doubt on the role of Australopithecus afarensis as a modern human ancestor. Now, the authorities know better, and the authorities have said better in the leading journals. We need to change the textbooks, but they don't really have anything to put in its place, and so they haven't, and it's not likely to happen. Summarizing, then, with Australopithecus, we find that the shoulder bones, the collarbone that bears the weight of knuckle walkers, was like an ape, and so walked like an ape, and had a brain certainly the size of an ape, and teeth like the Galata baboon, an ape, arms like an ape that would reach down and allow them, as one author said, to scratch their ankles when they stood upright. Hands like an ape, and legs like an ape, and feet like an ape, and toes like an ape, according to the leading authorities. What do you think this was? Must have been a duck. No, I think when we look at this first example that is on the bottom rung of the ladder that's supposed to lead to man, we have apes. Now, the next one is Homo erectus, that we'll consider in the next session. But the first one that gets most of the attention today lends no support to evolution. You look in the zoo today, you see a variety of apes. There were more in the past. This was one of them that has become extinct, but it was definitely an ape. In our first session on fossil man, we looked at the evidence regarding Australopithecus. This is the first on the rung of the ladder that leads up to modern men on this ladder of graduated fossil men that's supposed to be a demonstration of evolution. But as we look at this first rung of the ladder, including Lucy, one of them, we see that these were apes. This is not a conclusion that we reach because of our Sunday school lessons, but because of paleoanthropology and because of the statements of the leading authorities about the nature of these specimens. There obviously are those who will say this is an ancestor of man, but often they're the ones that found them, or as we say down in Texas, they have a dog in the fight. But they have others who are leading authorities in the field who point out with good reason that this is not the case. Many times the evidence is gerrymandered, and we saw demonstrations of that. The next one on the rung of the ladder is Homo erectus. that's supposed to lead on up eventually to man. And here we go back in history to look at the beginning of the evidence for Homo erectus. Historically, this is where the search for fossil man begins. In this famous picture, we see the leading paleoanthropologist of the time, actually there at Cambridge, and we see Black and Dawson and Oakley and those who were convinced that the Piltdown man was an excellent fossil specimen that was leading to man. This was an ancestor of man, and of course it was a fraud. It was in the textbooks for over 40 years before it was finally exposed as fraud, and the men of science eventually did. It should have been done much earlier. It was very crudely stained and filed. The evidence was excluded from the leading authorities. Louis Leakey complained bitterly that while he was a student there at Cambridge, the bones were there and he was not allowed to examine them like these famous men did, who were willing to line up and agree that this was a fossil man. But when they finally did allow them to be examined, it was acknowledged to be a fraud. Very interesting statement is made about that by Roger Lehmann. Again, editor of Research News, in his book Bones of Contention. And by the way, the book Bones of Contention, while affirming great ages and certainly written by a devout believer in evolution, nevertheless is pretty historically accurate and is an interesting book and tells the story of exactly how these things were found and the conclusions that were reached and why. But regarding the Piltdown man and this picture that we looked at just a moment ago, how is it that trained men, the greatest experts of their day, could look at a set of modern human bones, the cranial fragments, and see a clear simian signature in them? Now, they saw this. They saw ape, simian signature in what was actually a modern human bone, and then see in an ape's jaw the unmistakable signs of humanity. Now, it was from an ape, but they saw humanity in it. Now, how is it that the greatest experts of their day could do that? We think experts know these things. He says the answers inevitably have to do with the scientists' expectations and their effects on the interpretation of the data. As he pointed out earlier, they have to interpret. The key issue is inferring a genetic relationship based on similarities that they see. Well, they expect to see certain similarities, and they see what they tell us about it. Someone says, if I hadn't have believed it, I wouldn't have seen it, is probably a better depiction of what we see in this case, as acknowledged by Roger Lehmann. We go back in time, and after the Piltdown man, we found that Henry Osborn of the American Museum of Natural History decided that we needed a fossil man over in America. Maybe he thought the people in Nebraska looked primitive, and so he went to Nebraska and found a tooth that he says looked like this in real life. This is Australopithecus Harold Cooki. Harold Cook was the one who actually found the bone and brought it to Dr. Osborn. But he restored it and had this made the front page of the New York Times. It said he walked erect and had a tail. And anyway, this was America's answer to the Piltdown man, the fossil man from America, Australopithecus Harold Cooki. Well, he allowed the experts to examine this, and they began to look at more evidence. Several were very, very skeptical. And then the next year, they found a complete jawbone with several teeth like this in it, and it turned out to be an extinct peccary, or a type of pig. As one person, that's one case where a pig made a monkey out of a man, and some of them suggested that maybe they should have called it Hesperopigdon cuckoo. He took a lot of flack, and I think appropriately. But this is the nature of the history of the early stages of fossil man, and it begins in this category of Homo erectus. Another example is the Java man. This was found by Eugene Dubois. He read, according to his own acknowledgement, Darwin's statement somewhere, there's an ape more human-like or a human more ape-like, and this will be the evidence that'll be found, so he went out to find it, and he traveled to Java. He thought the people in Java looked primitive. This was a part of his racist concept, and so he looked for primitive man there on the island of Java. He found a very human-like leg bone. He found a very ape-like head bone, about 75 yards apart in different layers. A few teeth were found later, but that's the total of what he found. More evidence has been found subsequently which did not fit with his conclusions, but this ape skull and human leg makes an ape man, and put them together and restored them to look very, very ape-manish. He did find other evidence that he didn't tell people about, and you don't learn about this usually, certainly not in your undergraduate work. This is Wajak 1, as he's restored by Coons, a very large-brained, much larger than our average today. This was almost 1,700 cc's compared to our average 1,440. Was found in the same area, in the same layer, but he hid it. He put it under his dining room floor and nailed the boards over it, and it wasn't for 40 years later that they finally found out about Wajak 1 that was found with this partial cranium and partial leg bone. But that's all faded, though not from all the textbooks, some of them, by more recent finds of excellent examples, and they weren't nearly as old as they thought. And now that they realize that there were very modern-looking skeletons, forms there found with them. And here we find one of the leading authorities here reporting in Science News, Milford Woolproof of the University of Michigan. He argues that Homo erectus fossils actually belong to an anatomically diverse form of Homo sapien. That's us. And so we see Eskimos that are a little different, and Australian Aboriginals that are a little different, and we see the Bushmen that are a little different from the Ubangis, and we see variations of good men, and this was a variation, but it was a Homo sapien. This was a man, and Java man doesn't belong in the lineup anymore. He was already Homo sapien, according to the leading authorities. He's in the textbooks many times, though acknowledging that many of them have been removed. 1470 skull, new Kenya National Museum, found by Richard Leakey, is one of the leading representatives today of Homo erectus. Originally, it caused a lot of problem. They had to do some redating and some gerrymandering in order to get this to fit into the tree. But here is a very human-looking skull that's supposed to have been found back at the time, actually, of Australopithecus, but okay, it's very human-looking, so they put it in Homo erectus. But notice the description that we find in National Geographic regarding Leakey's find. Either we toss out this skull or we toss out our theories of early man, asserts anthropologist Richard Leakey, of this 2.8 million year old fossil, which he has tentatively identified as belonging to our own genus. Now 2.8 million, that puts it right in the middle of Australopithecus. You got to do something about that. So they took it to California and had it redated, and it's now 1.9, we're told. But it's still very, very human-like. It simply fits no theories. Notice the description. No previous models of human beginnings. The skull, surprisingly large brain case. It's all compared to ours, but certainly within the range of humans today. It leaves in ruins the notion that all early fossils can be arranged in an orderly sequence of evolutionary change. Now, a large brain case with this no brow ridges, vaulted skull. Now, brow ridges are supposed to be primitive. I get a little bit sensitive about brow ridges indicating that people are primitive. But this one didn't have that, and so it was supposed to be non-primitive and a large brain case. But it's back at the time of Australopithecus. We learned more about the brain case when we looked at the endocasts. These are casts that fill the cavity of the brain, and then the bone peels away, and we see exactly what the brain looked like. Here's some pictures of those endocasts that tell us give excellent evidence for exactly what the brain looked like. Dean Falk is one of the experts in studying this, and he says this is not Homo habilis. Homo habilis is very ape-like. That's used to be touted as leading to man, but when they found the more complete specimen with the huge arms, actually much longer arms than most apes have, and very small brain case, they have relegated this to the category of apes at this point. But it's different, he says. This is similar to the African progid, that is Homo erectus, but the 1470 skull is shaped like that of a modern human. Now, they don't tell you that in the textbooks, but this brain was like a modern human. We're also referred to another example of Homo erectus. This is found by Richard Leakey, and this is the boy from Turkana, Turkana boy. They thought it was 11 years old initially, and then found out it was even younger than that, which makes for a significant problem. Notice again from National Geographic, the boy from Turkana was surprisingly large compared with modern boys his age. Could well have grown to 6 feet. Leakey says the boy from it would be unnoticed in a crowd today, and then continues with this amazing statement. This combines with the previous discoveries of Homo erectus to contradict a long-held idea that humans have grown larger over the millennia. Have you heard that idea and that it's been contradicted? Well, if you've got a boy that is 5'6" and is 9 years old, it doesn't sound very small to me. In fact, that's larger than the boys that we have today. And this is documented in Origin of Humankind by Richard Leakey. We now know that it was 9 years old, not 11, and it was 5'6" here, shown with Dr. White, who illustrates just how large this 9-year-old was. Other problems have been found with Homo erectus. The specimen Howells goes on to say, with a date of about 4.4 million, and he's talking here about another specimen that sometimes called 271, Kanapi man, and it's from the area of Kanapi. 4 million. Well, now that gets us back earlier than virtually all of the Australopithecine specimens, but it could not be distinguished from Homo sapien. Morphologically, that's by the shape, outward shape, or by multivariate analysis, by Patterson and myself in 1967, or by much more searching analysis by others since then. Now, this has been around a while. They've known about it. It couldn't be distinguished from Homo sapien, but it was older than those things that are supposed to have led to Homo sapien. So what do they do with it? They call it a Homo erectus. I don't think that solves the problem. Now, multivariate analysis is a very thorough comparison. We talked about the eyeballing. This is similar to that. Well, with multivariate analysis, you measure a bone about 1,000 different ways, and you measure the bone you're comparing it with exactly the same way, about 1,000 different ways, and then you put it in a computer, and the computer gives you a statistical readout of just how similar they are. But by using that method, as well as morphologically and even more searching analysis, according to Howells, it couldn't be distinguished from Homo sapien. And it's older than anything supposed to have led to him. Homo erectus then is summarized this way. Java man no longer really in the lineup by most assessments, belonging to Homo sapien. Turkana boy is certainly there, but he's large and unnoticed in a crowd, larger than our boys today. 1470, according to Richard Leakey, like modern humans, and then the brains were like modern humans. The Latoy footprints are put in the category of Homo erectus, but they are people, according to Mary Leakey, not unlike ourselves. She discovered them. And then you have Canopy Man at 4.4 million that's indistinguishable from Homo sapien. What are we looking at here? Is there any question about what we're looking at here? These are people. These are men. Some of them may have lived in the jungle. Some of them may have lived in caves. We have people doing that today. But these were people. These were good men, and that's not based on wishful thinking. When you look at the actual evidence and the statements by the leading authorities, that's what you have to say. It's not really honest to say it otherwise. That brings us then to the next rung of the ladder, Neanderthal. Well, we've all seen the Neanderthal reconstructions. We know this certainly looks like an ape man. And yes, the reconstructions certainly do. And if we found those in the back alley, it would scare the living daylights out of us. This is a type that was first found in the Neander Valley, hence the name Neanderthal, in Germany, and restored very quickly to look like this by Marcel and Buell. And he had, of course, read Darwin, and he believed devoutly there was an ape man somewhere, and so he restored it to look like that. Remember Houghton's statement, you can model on a Neanderthaloid skull the features of a chimpanzee or the lineaments of a philosopher. Well, he did a lot of that modeling and did so very poorly, as leading authorities acknowledge today. This is Marcel and Buell, devout believer who was responsible for this misleading representation. Let's set the record straight with Ian Tattersall. Now, this is no lightweight. He is head of the Department of Anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History. Again, this is not a creationist. This is not my idea. Head of the Department of Anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History. This fellow knows a little bit about anthropology. He says, quite as important as new Neanderthal finds in the 50s, and this helped us change our view of Neanderthals, we found some new specimens, was the recognition finally that the stoop-shouldered, bent-kneed stereotype of these humans created by Marcel and Buell was totally false. Now, that's his assessment. The head of the Department of Anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History said, this is false. But guess where you find it? In the museums and in the textbooks. This is not the way it looked. Richard Leakey comments on this. He says, to refer to someone as a Neanderthal was and still is to some extent an intended insult. But then he says the rehabilitation, however, began in the mid-50s when two anatomists, William Strauss, A.J.E. Cave, undertook a second reconstruction, a body which, though somewhat stocky, was essentially like modern man's. And essentially meaning he doesn't see any difference, and says they would be unnoticed in a crowd again. Put him in a Brooks Brothers suit and you'd never know that he was different. He's been rehabilitated, according to Richard Leakey. He goes on to say the brain is slightly larger than modern humans, averaging about 1,600 cc's, again compared to our 1,440. The Neanderthals' average height was 1.67 meters, that's 5'8". That's not considered unusual. The average Oriental is just a little bit shorter than that. And so well within the range of variation that we see today, not unique, and is unquestionably, Richard Leakey says, Homo sapien. That's us. That's modern man. Interesting that Coons attempted two different restorations from the same Neanderthal skull, neither one looking like the typical Neanderthal skull. But here we see a rather philosophical-looking face on the left, and then maybe somebody that belongs on Mad Magazine on the right, but both of them from the same Neanderthaloid skull. Matt Cartmill, that we introduced earlier, claiming he was a leading authority, he is president of the American Association of Physical Anthropology. Again, these are not lightweights. I tend to think the Neanderthals, had fully human language. After all, they had larger brains than those of most modern humans. They made elegant stone tools. They knew how to use them. These were people making tools very much like the American Indians made tools. This is an example of some of their handiwork, a flute that was reported on in Science and Scientific American that has exactly the same scale that we do, the do-re-mi scale that we have today. They were musical. And they were religious, according to Richard Leakey. He speaks of the tomb that they found that was buried with flowers and with specific arrangements indicating a kind of burial ceremony. He says the arrangement of flowers was not random. They were carefully placed around the body. A concern for the fate of the humans and the ritual burial. They speak of a deep feeling for the spiritual quality of life. This doesn't sound like the Neanderthal that I was taught about. Again, problems after problems. Another one showed up in Israel, and here's Bar Yosef of the Peabody Museum at Harvard, who found a number of Neanderthal skulls in caves up on Mount Carmel in Israel. But the problem was the modern preceded the Homo sapien in Neanderthals at Mount Carmel. The results have shaken the traditional evolutionary scenario, producing more questions than answers. Well, if you find the Neanderthals in a higher stratum that's covered by travertine, the moderns were lower. Yes, more questions than answers. Certainly doesn't fit the view we're taught in the textbook. Many have reported that the DNA has been analyzed and they were very different according to the DNA, and some of the press did report it that way. Here from Scientific American, some of the researchers believe the data can be interpreted differently. The amount of diversity between Neanderthals and living humans is not exceptional. We see more diversity in a number of species and in humans, and they point out some of the diverse types that have sometimes been found. It's within the range of variation that we can see today. More recently, very interesting and perhaps more definitive, is the protein from Neanderthals has been sequenced. And this was from Iraq. And the team found the Neanderthal sequence was the same as modern humans. Guess what these things were? These were people. According to Richard Leakey, he was unquestionably Homo sapien. There was a ridiculous reconstruction. In fact, Howell says that Bucellin got the ankle bones on backwards. By all laws of physics, he should have fallen on his face. Fully human language. The DNA overlaps with humans. Moderns were, and the proteins were identical. The moderns were earlier. The brain was larger. They were religious and were musical. These were not only people, they were good people. And according to the way they made their flutes and some of the tools, they were ahead of me, certainly, in that department. They've been grossly slandered by ridiculous reconstruction, but these are people. Richard Leakey says unquestionably Homo sapien. Now, this is not a Sunday school class conclusion. This is what the leading authorities document. Now, we've got apes and we've got men. And where's the evidence that moderns evolved from ancestors? Well, you can draw lines and you can line them up like the pig to the bull to the man, but that's not science. That's not good evidence. Mary Leakey made an interesting observation about some of these trees that people line up, more recently quoted by Associated Press. Since scientists can never prove, and this is what Leakey was saying, you just infer based on similarities. You can never prove a particular scenario of human evolution. Because of that, he says, all these trees of life with their branches of our ancestors, she says, that's a lot of nonsense. Well, there's good reason for her saying that. Now, she remains an evolutionist, unlike her husband, who gave up on Darwin. In fact, she commented on that, saying he was a little touched before he died. Not exactly an objective analysis of what he was saying. But she does say these trees that are in the textbook that show this kind of human evolution and this direction, or by another authority, said it's just a lot of nonsense. It's people drawing lines, and there are no lines on the bones. We can summarize the evidence then for the proposed ancestors of man this way. You go to the zoo and you can see a variety of apes. They don't all look the same. You can see a significant variety, all kinds, and there used to be more in the past. As we saw from the documented experts, there were greater numbers of phyla, greater diversity in the past. We have fewer today. Some of them are extinct, and you can go back and find some of those that are extinct today, but they're apes. They're a part of the variety of apes that have existed, greater in the past. And we look at the fossil record of humans, and likewise, we see a variety, and sometimes you can see what looks different to us, to our eye, not different to their eyes. And you could say some of them just look rather peculiar. I understand people thinking that, but they're humans, and they're excellent humans, and we need to understand that. And that's what we see in the fossil record. We see apes, a variety. We see humans, some variety. Now, they've desperately tried to shoehorn things in between, and at that point, I think they've just wound up looking foolish. But what you find is either apes or humans, or as Dwayne Gish used to say, you take a little incus opus and a little hocus pocus, and you come up with Pithecus spoofus. And that's what's been shoehorned in the middle. That's a picture of the actual evidence for fossil men. The record supports just exactly what the creationists would expect, a distinct, separate kind for each. A gap before the apes, a gap after the apes before you get to man. This is what we found in the fossil record earlier. The fossil record of men favors creation because of that, and it is against the idea of evolutionary progression. I want to make one more point before we conclude, referring back to some of the implications of evolution of man doctrine. If we look at Origin of the Species, that's really not the title. Many people are unaware that it was actually Origin of the Species and Preservation of Favored Races. This is a photo of the actual original edition, and you see the term favored races up about 2/3 of the way up. This would never fly today, and so they edited it and took that out. But Darwin was a very devout racist, as were most of the people who were following his thinking. In Descent of Man, he makes this statement: at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races. Now, you've got savage races and you've got civilized races, you see, and one's going to exterminate the other throughout the world. At that time, the anthropomorphous apes will no doubt be exterminated. He says the break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian and some ape today, as low as a baboon, instead of the now Negro or Australian and gorilla. Now, if that doesn't make your flesh crawl, it's amazing. Obviously, he's a hero in the minds of many, but if any so-called hero were to make that kind of a statement today, he wouldn't be a hero anymore. I think he needs to be exposed for what he is. Stephen Gould has acknowledged what happened as a result of his teaching. He says biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. Increased by orders of magnitude. That's the fruit of the tree. And then he goes on to say the pervasive racism of the white scientist. This is typical following Darwin's book, Origin of the Species. They look to the activities of their own children for comparison with normal adult behaviors in lower races. Now, Stephen Gould is not saying this. This doesn't represent Stephen Gould, but he's talking about the typical white scientist following Darwin's introduction of Origin of the Species and as a consequence of it. He gives an example of this kind of thinking from Henry Fairfield Osborn, who was curator of the American Museum of Natural History that we referred to earlier. What did he say? Now, this is not Darwin saying it, but he's quoting the head of the American Museum of Natural History. The standard intelligence of the average adult Negro is similar to that of the 11-year-old of the species Homo sapien. Negroes are not even in the same species, according to him. That's just thoroughly disgusting. But that's the fruit of the tree, even according to Stephen Gould. When we look at the world around us, we see differences in facial structure, in skin color, in brow ridges, in eye color, in hair color, in straight hair and curly hair, and sometimes there are suites of these variances that collect, and you get dark skin and kinky hair, though you do have people with white skin that have kinky hair. In Ireland, you got a lot of people with red hair and blue eyes and freckles, and usually there's not a lot of prejudice associated with that collection, but it does get associated with other collections foolishly. You look at these people, do you see a primitive man there? Many people will look at the fellow in the lower left-hand corner and say he looks primitive. This is Dr. Goolagong. He has a doctorate from Oxford. Now, I went to Cambridge. We talk about people from Oxford, but I assure you, this is a good man. He has excellent, well, he has an IQ higher than 90% of our audience. He's a brilliant individual. You thought he was primitive? Shame on you. It's really been interesting to see the results of our National Genome Project, a monumental scientific project that has demonstrated that when we look biologically, when we look at the genome, you can't find race. Here's a headline from the Union Tribune in San Diego: "No trace of race. Genome Project proves that nothing biological separates peoples." It's not there. Often you can find greater difference between a brother and a sister than you can between what's called today a black man and a white man. Scientific American has explored the matter at length and found it doesn't exist in answer to that question. We've been looking at scientific evidence. At this point, let's just compare the models and the implication and use a passage of Scripture that will help define the position very much in contrast to that of the evolutionist, and we'll conclude with this. Genesis 3, Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. And I think that makes us all brothers. Sometimes I chide some of my black friends, you know, they talk about the brothers. I want to know why they're leaving me out. I think we're all children of the same mother and father, and that we need to act as if we're brethren, and that's what creation produces. When you have that concept, that's where it leads. Not that all people go where it leads, but they should. Evolution leads in a different direction.